Okay, thank you. My name is Marco Gillies. I'm going to talk about virtual reality for learning social skills, kind of. I have two big disclaimers. Firstly, this is a sort of joint talk. It's Sylvia Pan, Xueni Pan, and myself. And actually, Sylvia's name should be first, really, because this is primarily her work. The reason it's really me standing here is that Sylvia's on maternity leave at the moment, so I'm standing in. The other sort of reason I feel a little bit of an interloper here is that I'm really impressed to see so much interesting work of putting VR in practice in classrooms, and actually that's not what I'm going to talk about so much. So I'm going to talk about research that could be applied within the classroom. We are applying it to real training, but I can't actually talk about that. Firstly, because it's at very early stages, and secondly, because it's not actually within our teaching institution, Goldsmiths. It's work we're doing for a hospital, and they would rather we didn't talk about it yet. But so I'm actually going to step back quite a lot and talk about sort of a lot of research that has been happening that I have been involved with and some that I've been less involved with over the years. And you'll see from the quality of the graphics that this is going back quite a few years now. So that's my disclaimer. So I will get to learning social skills, but via a slightly different route. Now, many of you who have been in VR, one of the favorite demos is something a bit like this. This is called the virtual pit. If you've experienced it, you put on a VR headset, and in front of you, you can just about see, you walk onto this little ledge, and there is an empty space, and you can see a huge, dangerous-looking drop in front of you. It's not there. It's, the floor is very physically strong underneath you, but still the vast majority of people are afraid, / incapable of taking the step forward over what appears to be a giant drop. I'm mentioning this because this is one of the most famous sort of compelling experiences of VR, and if you've done VR, you've probably done something like this. There is another one that hasn't been experienced quite as much, but I think is even more powerful than that. And so if you want to think about the power of the physical space in VR, there's something even more powerful, which is the power of the social space in VR. So it's this experience. It's the experience of being inside a virtual environment with a life-size virtual person in front of you. And that is more like being in an encounter with a real person, a real social experience than any other media experience I've certainly ever had. It's very, very different from seeing a character on screen. It's very, very different from a Skype call where you're actually interacting with somebody, and I'll talk a little bit later why that is. I'm going to give a little bit of history about that, but first I want to explain what's going on in this image because you may not be quite so familiar with this technology. A lot of what I'm going to show is actually VR using a cave environment, which is less typical these days. A cave is essentially, if you think it's a kind of small, say 3 meter by 3 meter room with a screen in front of you, a screen either side, and a screen on the floor. Each of those screens are projected in 3D. So you have 3D stereo glasses seeing a different image in each eye, and your head tracked so that the display of the image is altered so that it exactly tracks your the movement of your head, both in terms of rotation and in terms of head movement. So this, in many ways, is quite a powerful experience. It's quite similar to a head-mounted display. It has one big advantage that you actually see your own body. And it doesn't matter so much that this is in a cave. It's not really the point of my talk, but I will show you some slides that look a bit like this, where somebody some person and a virtual person in front of them, that's probably not how you're familiar with experiencing VR, because if you've got a headset on, somebody taking a picture of you will not be able to see the virtual person, but that's just an explanation of that rendering. So I just want to take you through a little bit of my history and of this. And I was first really introduced to this idea when I joined Mel Slater's lab at UCL, and they showed me this demo. Now, this is a public speaking demo. So the idea is, it's always a good one to do a talk like this, because it is a talk like this. You, as a participant, are asked to stand in front of this virtual audience and give a talk to them just as I'm giving a talk to you. And there are various varieties of programmable audiences, ranging from a nice audience that will smile at you and stare and nod the entire time. It's actually a little borderline creepy. To the interesting one, which is the terrible audience, which slumps backwards, looks around, kind of mutters sort of annoyingly, falls asleep, and eventually some of them, just get up and walk out. And the experience of giving a talk to this audience is actually incredibly powerful. And it's incredibly difficult to give a talk to the nasty audience. You really feel you cannot go on. And, I wasn't involved in this part of the work, but they did many experiments on this, and people, I think one of the most interesting results is that people were asked to rate various aspects of their performance, and in particular they were asked to rate their preparation and their materials, something that has nothing to do with what happened in the space and something that happened entirely before they encountered their audience. But giving a talk to the bad audience, people gave a talk to the bad audience, rated their materials and preparation far worse than the people that gave the talk to the good audience. By the way, we ended up sort of giving the talk to the good audience last to everybody, so that they had, they went away happy as opposed to, and self-confident as opposed to depressed. So this is, this was the first thing that really showed, that this could have a power similar to real social experiences. This is another example. By this point, I was kind of on the staff, and I spent most of my time writing software to make these kind of experiences happen. This is, you just got on a tube train, and this was with psychiatrist Daniel Freeman, working on with healthy populations, but also populations with paranoid ideation, so people who were having thoughts that various people had negative viewpoints on them. And run with healthy populations, I mean, in a sense, someone with a paranoid ideation, you'd expect to have unrealistic ideas about what was happening. But this audience did nothing. It didn't interact with you at all. But nonetheless, people read a lot into it. People said that it was much nicer than a real experience. People aren't so forthcoming with their feelings in a real situation. I thought they were pretty friendly. They weren't pretty friendly. I wrote the code. I know exactly what they were doing. They were doing nothing. They were playing back clips. They weren't responding at all to the presence. And people said much more extreme things than this. So something is really happening here. And then with Sylvia Pan, we started developing experiments which looked at actual interactions. So people could have actual conversations one-to-one with virtual characters. This is the first example we did. An example for the results here is that we programmed at certain points the character to step towards the participant. And we saw spikes in their galvanic skin response, indicating sort of heightened emotional tension at that point. So this is definitely having an effect. And it was definitely sort of the body language of it, and I'll come back to that. We had another study where we looked at varying the body language of a character for being either more shy or more confident, where the confident character was sort of borderline a bit aggressive. And we found that very much changed the the participant's behavior. Now, what I believe is happening here is that the big difference between virtual reality and almost any other media experience is that if you have a character in that space, you are sharing a 3D virtual space with that person, real or virtual. So if you consider a Skype call, something I'm sure most of you have done, you are really talking with another person. You're having a real conversation, but it doesn't feel as if you were in the room with them. And that creates an experientially different, it just feels different. It doesn't feel as much like a real encounter. And I would hypothesize, and I was just saying in the break now that I really should do something more than hypothesizing about this, but because I've been talking about this for years, that is in large part because so much of our body language is predicated on that spatial relationship. The obvious one is our distance. You know, if I'm on a Skype call and I move forward, it's kind of zooming in. It doesn't feel like someone's getting closer to you. They're at the same distance. In VR, they're closer to you. It feels closer to you. But also things like eye contact, gaze. You know, you're looking out of the screen or you're not looking out of the screen on Skype. Whereas if you share a 3D environment, you're actually making eye contact. I'm looking around at different people in their eyes. You cannot do that on a flat screen environment. It relies on the fact that I'm in a spatial relationship with all of you. And you can reproduce that in VR. And there are also once you've got more than one person, there are all sorts of spatial things. I could look at you, I could look at you, and that has social meaning. So that is my hypothesis about VR works. And where does this come to education? What that means is that we can use this for learning social skills. Now, most professions will rely on a certain degree. I mean, I'm actually using a model from Donald Xueni, but most professions have an explicit knowledge. So we're in an engineering department. Engineers will have an explicit knowledge that is, the mathematics, physics, solving equations. Doctors will have explicit subject knowledge that relates to anatomy, as we've seen this morning, or physiology. But there's also very important tacit knowledge that is part of professional practice, but is not so easy to teach explicitly. And, for example, for doctors need to be able to interact with patients. So, it's very interesting to see Mohammed's talk this morning about ward rounds. I mean, I think that's exactly the kind of skill that's very difficult to learn. You can't learn in the classroom yet. And part of that is that these skills are tacit, which means that we can do them, but we do not know we're not able to say how we do them. They're embodied in that we do them with our bodies. I won't try and talk about bodies and minds, but the body is integral to them. We can't really do body language without our bodies. And then non-verbal, which is kind of another way of saying we cannot put them into words. So Sylvia has produced some examples of this. I'm going to show you. This is a scenario for GPs to learn about, to practice working with patients who want antibiotics but shouldn't get them. And we're talking about really quite stroppy patients.
Antibiotics, and she immediately got better. So all she needs is some antibiotics this time.
Okay, I hear what you're saying.
It's actually, very often, a cough is caused by a virus rather than a bacteria.
So doctors should not be prescribing antibiotics. They should be explaining why it is not an appropriate treatment.
Unfortunately, that's not how
The health authority. I think you are very denying medicine.
Many patients disagree.
I appreciate your concern. Thank you for your feedback.
My mother worked and paid national health.
Turn the audio down. And so these were very difficult patients, and they're entirely pre-programmed. And the interesting thing here is we run this study, and basically most of the working GPs and all of the practicing all of the trainees prescribed antibiotics. Though these people aren't real. They're not real. There are actual doctors watching and judging their behavior, which they know they should not be prescribing, but they felt social pressure in this situation. We did another one which was about, I'll maybe mention it briefly, but was about detecting potential child abuse, so safeguarding. I might skip to the theory. So these are examples where you can practice interactions that otherwise would have to be having in real life. Safeguarding interactions you can't even do with actors. You can't get child actors to pretend to be abused. And what this makes possible is that something called deliberate practice. So, there's a big body of educational literature saying that focused types of practice are good ways to learn things. And again, if we're in an engineering department, it's a really good way to learn things like solving equations. You just do lots of different problems, and if you're a good teacher, you can set particular types of problem that sort of get harder and harder, or practice particular skills. I teach programming, that's how you teach them. It's not everything. You want other more open-ended, creative problem-solving skills, but it's a really good way to learn those fundamental skills. You can't learn social interaction like that. Well, maybe you can if you have a VR experience, because you can create these experiences that feel real, but which can actually be really tightly controlled. And we haven't done this yet. If you can create sort of infinite variations of an experience, you could practice it again and again and again, so that you could start to learn some of these soft, tacit, embodied skills in actually quite ways that are not so dissimilar from how you learn the things that are easy to teach, like solving equations. And I think that's potentially really powerful. I'm probably out of time. I'll put up a last slide. I've got 2 minutes. Okay. There's probably sort of maybe a little bit of concern here, saying, all these real-time interactions with characters, don't you have to solve the entirety of AI to make this happen? And we haven't, unfortunately. I'm not sort of having breakthrough technologies. This is kind of the model we're using. And I won't go into the full details here, but there's 2 important points. One is that the dialogue is pre-scripted, but there's actually a human being there selecting dialogue choices that are appropriate. So there's a human in the loop. They're not doing the speaking, and they're not extemporizing it, but they've got a bunch of choices. They choose the appropriate one. It might be possible to automate this completely with natural language processing, but in the settings we've used it, actually having a human there is not only possible, it's actually actively useful because they're curating the entire experience. The second is that the body language is automated. And there are a bunch of actually very simple hacks that can create realistic-looking body language. One is always maintaining an appropriate social distance. Another is appropriately changing your use of nods and eye gaze based on whether you're talking or listening. There's some very simple hacks that I could, look in that paper if you're interested, or I can tell you more about. And that's really important because, our body language, you can't expect an operator to control the body language because, it's tacit embodied. We do it, we don't know how we do it, and also it's extremely real-time and fast. So, you can't, there's just no way somebody's going to effectively be able to puppeteer body language. So, but it is possible to automate reasonably good body language that's convincing. And I could go on to huge questions about how real does it have to be, how convincing, how interactive. I don't know the answers to that. But so that body language sign creates this power that VR has to recreate the feeling of a social experience, very different from any other standard screen-based media. While the hard AI bits can be got around through use of an operator. So that's it. VR is a very, very powerful medium for teaching social skills. It has the potential to allow us to deliberately practice social interactions in a way that simply has not been possible. I mean, the obvious point that I didn't mention is these social interactions are not normal social, down the pub, on the cafe type of interactions. We're talking about difficult professional social interactions that people will not have been exposed to. And that, it's the technology is there. It's not as difficult as it first seems from, if I were to explain it to you. When I say it's there, it's there in some of our research labs, but it's not very far from being something that people could implement in Unity. Well, I've implemented it in Unity. I've got a MOOC which tells you how to implement a lot of these things in Unity if you're interested. So we can, this I think will be the next one of the next exciting frontiers of VR education.
Thank you very much, Marco. Very interesting topic. Any questions from the audience, please?
How difficult were the scripts for the body language?
You mean the code, the scripts? It's actually pretty simple stuff. So, I mean, at the time I was originally doing it, I sort of blood, sweat, and tears of C++. Now in Unity, it's, you have essentially an eye gaze loop which looks or doesn't look, and you vary that based on whether you're talking or listening and various parameters of that. You have a distance script which maintains an appropriate distance. You're always turning to the person in the right way. And then you have a number of example loops of gestures that you add in and play, slightly randomly, but choosing different gestures. The main big important thing is that you know whether the character's listening or talking, and you vary that accordingly. Just simply the fact that you know that the human's talking and you respond as if you're listening is itself really pretty powerful because, well, we're quite egocentric. We want to think people are listening to us. So this is not quite relevant, but I always remember funny things. So I was working for Mel Slater on this, and we were having a conversation. He just tried out the demo, and we were sitting there. We were standing in the cave with this character next to us, this one, and he still had the headset on and the microphone, and he was like, I was saying, this is what I think we should do. No, so I think we should do something else, blah, blah, blah. And eventually, she was still nodding because he was taking this. See, she agrees with me. So I couldn't argue with that.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Here, psych.
Okay. Can you tell us a little bit about the evaluation? So how do you get about
So it's mostly quantitative with qualitative elements. So it's mostly Sylvia who does the evaluation side, but her preferred way is to look at, you can do questionnaires, they tell you something, you can interview people, but she's most interested in particular behavioral measures. And that is, it's quite difficult, that's quite bespoke. So for example, in this experiment, I won't go into full details, but at a certain point, the character's phone rings, and she leaves and says, I'll be back in a minute. You're left there, and there's a bell on the desk. And the measure was how long before you ring the bell to call the character back. And they rang more quickly for the confident, slightly stroppy character than for the shy character. Similarly, did you prescribe antibiotics or not? That was the main response variable. We had biosensors, we had questionnaires, lots of other things, but that was the main variable. Here was looking at the doctor's notes and rating how well they detect, sort of how based on the notes, did they effectively pick up on the safeguarding issues or not? So that's, there's not a one-size-fits-all evaluation, but, responding correctly given that situation, and particularly if there's a sort of yes-no kind of measure of it or a quality measure of it.
Any other questions? I don't think we have any virtual ones. No? Okay, I think we should
Okay, thank you.
Marco.